For our newscast tonight, President Park Geun-hye is in Davos on the eve of the World Economic Forum. There, her focus is simple and straightforward: get the movers and shakers of the business world to look for investment opportunities in Korea. The long arm of the law metes out a punishment for the former chief of Korea's spy agency on bribery charges. Won Se-hoon is sentenced to 2 years in prison after taking money under the table from a businessman while in office. Public anxiety is high after the recent mass leak of personal data about how such information can be used for crimes. The government announces a set of measures to minimize damage to clients and prevent future leaks. Stay with us for these stories and more.
It is 4 a.m. in Kingston, Jamaica, 10 a.m. in Davos, and 6 on a Wednesday evening here in Seoul. I'm Kim Hyun-ji.
Thank you for joining us. Welcome to Early Edition at 6. I'm Daniel Che. We begin with the aftermath of the data leak. Korea's financial regulator has drawn up a comprehensive set of measures to better protect confidential customer data held by financial institutions.
This in the wake of the country's worst data breach by financial institutions, with millions of Koreans affected. Our Ji Myung-kil has more.
The government announced a set of measures on Wednesday designed to prevent future leaks and minimize the damage to clients if a leak does occur. In the midst of growing public anxiety about the possible financial crimes that could be committed using the stolen data, which includes bank account, credit card numbers, and personal credit records, financial firms will now be barred from collecting an excessive amount of personal data from customers. The government will also strengthen the punishment on institutions that use client data for their marketing activities.
Financial institutions will be prohibited from using client data for marketing purposes, and the CEOs of the financial firms in question will be subject to strong punishments.
Firms that are found to have used client data for marketing could be fined up to 1% of their sales in the event of a data breach.
The government will fine banks and credit card firms up to $4.6 million if they are found to have mismanaged personal data, and client data will be automatically discarded 5 years after a client's final transaction.
The government also plans to impose heavy fines on the 3 card firms that were breached, KB국민, 농협, and Lotte, in what is now one of the biggest information leaks in the nation's history, with nearly 20 million people affected. And at the press conference Wednesday, the chairman of Korea's financial watchdog offered to take full responsibility for the data breach.
We apologize for the data leak that inconvenienced the people. We will do our best to wrap the case up quickly and promise to prevent such mishaps in the future.
The government has rolled out its strongest ever measures to raise the severity of personal data theft. And with comprehensive probes to kick off soon, the government hopes to prevent similar cases from happening again in the future. Ji Myung-kil, Arirang News.
The government says it now suspects that the recent bird flu outbreak may also have been carried by a migratory bird called the bean goose, in addition to the Baikal teal ducks originally blamed for bringing the virus to Korea. The Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs said in a press briefing Wednesday morning that H5N8, the same AI strain found in the Baikal teal ducks, was detected in the carcasses of bean geese found near a reservoir where the outbreak was first detected in Gochang County, Jeollabuk-do Province. The ministry added that the number of farms in Korea infected with avian influenza has now increased to 8, and that 6 other farms are being inspected for signs of the virus. Staying on the bird flu scare in Korea, quarantine authorities are working round the clock to contain the avian influenza in the country's southern province of Jeollabuk-do, where 8 farms now are believed to have been hit. And nearly 300,000 ducks and chickens have been culled so far. Our Connie Lee brings us the story from the field.
The quarantine measures have been taken up a notch. 3 days have passed since the first confirmed case of the highly pathogenic H5N8 bird flu strain was found here in southern Korea.
The infected farms are blocked off like this. This means no one can come in and no one can get out.
And it doesn't appear as though the quarantine measures will be eased anytime soon.
이강 절대 들어오시면 안 되고 이 안으로는 들어오시면 안 된다. 이게 공기종으로 떠다니는 바이러스도 세통이 떨어지기 때문에 수도 그레스도 바로 또 전염이 될 수가 있으니까 얘가 저주기가 바로 옆에 있잖아요. 새들이 자주 날아다니니까 한번 공기종을 떨어뜨리면 바로 전염이 되니까 상시 이렇게 자주 해줘야 되고 상시 들어오는
Here in Jeollabuk-do province, about 300 kilometers south of Seoul, every vehicle entering and exiting the area is sterilized. But with a new suspected case emerging on Tuesday, the Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs has now ordered that ducks within a 3-kilometer radius of an infected farm be slaughtered as a preventive measure. This has been expanded from the previous 500-meter radius. But the farmers aren't the only ones affected by the latest case of avian influenza.
None of the customers are asking for the duck and chicken dishes, even though I explained to them that cooked meat is fine.
This restaurant has seen its number of customers cut in half since the AI outbreak.
This time is worse than the last bird flu scare we had. My restaurant was affected last time, but this time, because the virus was found in my neighborhood, less people are coming to eat here.
Korea has had 4 bird flu outbreaks since 2003. The last time was in 2011 when over 6 million birds were killed. Connie Lee, Arirang News.
We shift our focus to another story. President Park Geun-hye is in Davos for this year's World Economic Forum. Ahead of the forum's official opening, President Park spent the day meeting with business leaders from around the world to urge them to invest more in Korea. Our presidential office correspondent, Jin-ju, who is traveling with the president, has the details.
Promoting Korea to the world's business leaders was the name of the game for President Park on the eve of the World Economic Forum in Davos. Taking part in Korea Night, an event dedicated to showcasing Korean culture and technology, which has been held in Davos for 6 straight years now, President Park called on the world's most powerful executives to look for investment opportunities in Korea's so-called creative economy. She promised to ease regulations on investment, except for ones that are truly necessary, to foster a better environment for foreign businesses.
이처럼 기업 활동을 하는데 최적의 환경을 만들고 세계 기업들이 한국에 마음껏 투자할 수 있도록 문화를 개방하고 있습니다. 여러분들도 한국에서 도약의 기회를 잡을 수 있기를 바랍니다.
Among the global figures attending the event were Lloyd's chairman John Nelson and Jacob Frankel, chairman of JP Morgan Chase International. President Park also met with Cisco CEO John Chambers.
I've wanted to meet you for a year now. Thank you for giving us the time.
And discussed ways to cooperate in the sector of Internet of Everything.
특히 요즘 한국에서도 사물 인터넷에 대해서 주목들을 하고 얘기를 많이 하고 있습니다.
Internet of Everything is a rising industry that aims at connecting objects in homes, offices, cars, and elsewhere to the Internet so they automatically adjust to people's needs and preferences. President Park asked Cisco to actively invest in Korea and closely work with Korean firms to help the nation realize her vision of a creative economy. Chambers said Cisco's joint project with the British government to develop the European country's high-tech industry is very similar to President Park's vision. He then said he would be very happy to expand cooperation with Korean institutions and companies in the sector. President Park will be making an opening speech on the creative economy and entrepreneurship in the first session of this year's World Economic Forum on Wednesday. She will also pitch Korea's qualities to the CEOs of global companies like Qualcomm, Aramco, and Siemens. Jin-ju, Arirang News, Bern.
No one gets away from the long arm of the law, even if you're a former master chief or the former chief of Korea's spy agency. Won Se-hoon is one man who has been sentenced to 2 years in prison. He is accused of taking money under the table from a businessman while he was in office. Our Hwang Ji-hye has the details.
The Seoul Central District Court on Wednesday sentenced the former chief of Korea's spy agency Won Se-hun to 2 years in prison. One who headed the National Intelligence Service under President Lee Myung-kil was found guilty of taking bribes from the head of the now bankrupt Hwangbo Construction for helping the company win bids for major construction deals between 2009 and 2010. He took some 160 million won, or roughly $150,000 in kickbacks. The Seoul court also ordered the former spy chief to pay a fine of $150,000. The court pointed out that the heavy punishment was inevitable considering the seriousness of the crime and that Won had not expressed sincere regret for his actions. Won is also currently on trial on charges of meddling in the December 2012 presidential election. He was charged with ordering NIS agents to post internet comments in favor of then-ruling party candidate Park Geun-hye leading up to voting day. The trial on those charges will resume early next week, and a verdict is expected in February. Hwang Ji-hye, Arirang News.
Today, we take a look at an issue that has become a hot potato in the nation. The government announced earlier that it will allow hospitals to set up for-profit subsidiaries, such as restaurants, hotels, and funeral halls, to increase their revenue.
A coalition of doctors has argued that doing so would eventually privatize the healthcare sector, something the government says it has no plans to do. For an in-depth look, we are now joined by Dr. Hwang Jung-wook, professor of law at Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. Hello, Dr. Hwang. Thank you for making time to be here with us.
Thank you for having me.
So let's say that the government's policy of allowing hospitals to form for-profit subsidiaries will come into effect. What kind of changes would that bring to the healthcare sector?
There are two primary goals that government is looking for. One is that they would like to have private capital coming in. So this is a part of the larger plan to increase private investment in the economy. And two, by having the private investment coming into the medical care industry, they hope that the hospitals will be run more efficiently.
Well, the Korean Medical Association, they are strongly against this move, saying that it could be a prelude to privatization. But the government side is saying it is not, absolutely not. But what can we conclude from the current transition of events?
Well, some of it is semantics in a sense, because the KMA's position is that private capital will be coming into medical industry, which means that this private capital will be going after profit, not after quality medical care. So that's their main objection. On the other hand, government is saying that, well, we are allowing private capital only for ancillary services, not the core medical care services. So it's not true privatization. So they do have some disagreements about semantics.
Well, another thing the Doctors Association is against too is the government's approval of telemedicine services or remote medical care services in the future. Can you give us each side of the argument?
So government's main idea is that there are geographically remote regions where there are no hospitals. So we will allow telemedicine, basically doctors conferring with patients through internet or smartphones. And that will provide these underserved regions with much needed medical service. What the KMA is saying is that, well, this means that all this medical service will be directed towards large hospitals, which means that smaller hospitals and individual doctors will be left out and the quality will be compromised. Those will be two sides of the argument.
Okay, so we've heard both sides of the story regarding telemedicine. But Dr. Hwang, would you like to share us your 2 cents about the current state or the possible future of telemedicine?
Well, it is true that there are certain geographical regions where there are no hospitals, and plus with the recent technological advances like internet and widespread use of smartphones, has become much more feasible to provide services to people where there are no hospitals. But on the other hand, I do think the devil will be in the details. Experts who have been studying the medical care industry for half a century know that medicine is a market where the true competitive markets do not exist. So some sort of regulation is always needed, which means that the government safeguards that are being discussed, whether they'll be really properly implemented, I think that is a big question.
So the question is not a when, but how and how well it will be implemented in the future. It is, of course, it always starts with a good idea. The question is how the follow-through will be once it is implemented.
Absolutely, and if it was up to me, I wouldn't want to rush into the process like this, especially with possible market failures and abuses that could take place. So, I mean, if it were up to me, I will set up some test sites to study how the the situation is improving, as well as possible unintended consequences. But at the same time, I think the government is a bit in a rush to really publish these ideas that will spur investments at the moment.
Right, taking solid baby steps might be the wise thing right now.
I believe so, yes.
The Korean Medical Association has declared that it will launch a mass walkout in March because of this controversy going on. Is there any room for negotiation, and how should the two sides go about trying to narrow their differences?
Funnily enough, if you talk to the doctors as well as people in the government who are in this field, there is some consensus actually about what the true problem is. Sort of the economic force that's driving this conflict is the fact that smaller hospitals and a lot of individual doctors have not been doing so well. And part of the problem is that the medical costs that are being reimbursed by Korea's single-payer system has been too low. And government officials know that. So there is some consensus within the KMA as well as government officials who are in charge of these issues. But the problem is that politically it's really hot potato issues to say, let's raise the insurance premiums. But at the same time, if you think about it, if you want to maintain quality medical care, it's really impossible to maintain that without paying the proper costs. So at some point, some rational cost adjustment will be needed.
Well, Dr. Hwang Jung-kook, Professor of Law at Hankuk University of Foreign Studies, thank you so much for shedding some light on all the nooks and crannies of this topic. Do come in again when we need your help the most. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My pleasure.
Digging deeper, getting to the bottom of stories that impact your life. Talking with you on air and online. Connecting you with heroes and experts to help you understand the world's most pressing issues. News and current affairs at its best with Moon Gun-young and Daniel Che on Early Edition at 6.
Now shifting gears to the economy, Korean import prices rose by 2. A Korean media outlet has released a confidential report proving that the Japanese Navy and university medical schools conducted brutal experiments on living people during World War II. The top secret reports were stored at Japan's parliamentary library. Our Son Jang-in has the details.
This is a confidential report by the Japanese Navy exposing medical experiments conducted during World War II on living people. The report details an experiment on the absorption action of iperite, known as mustard gas, which rots human skin.
This is a dissertation based on a medical experiment on living bodies to develop protective army clothing.
It is part of a trove of documents stored at Japan's National Diet Library and released by a Korean media outlet, proving that Japanese army and university medical schools conducted gruesome medical experiments on war prisoners and civilians while they were still alive. It is the first evidence of such experiments having been conducted by institutions other than the infamous Japanese military Unit 731 in China. The documents also revealed that medical departments at 9 imperial universities in Japan during that time carried out similarly brutal medical experiments.
Even after 1930, the cruel experiments continued at other Japanese universities. Unfortunately, Unit 731 wasn't the only one to conduct experiments on living people.
One of the most notorious cases of human experimentation involved 8 members of a U.S. Air Force B-29 crew. The experiment was conducted in 1945 from May to June at Kyushu University in Japan. The American prisoners were subjected to vivisection and other gruesome experiments before being killed. Professors and students from the university were later brought to trial on charges of wrongful removal of body parts and cannibalism. None were convicted of war crimes. The Japanese government has yet to comment on the revelation and has thus far only ever acknowledged the existence of Unit 731, not the experiments it was reported to have conducted. 손정인, Arirang News.
In another news, Syria is being accused of systematic killings and torture on a truly ghastly scale. A report detailing the Assad regime's atrocities was released Tuesday as delegations began arriving in Switzerland for international talks aimed at ending the bitter conflict. Our Park Ji-won reports.
The new report reveals the Syrian government's systematic use of execution and torture. A team of former international war crimes prosecutors released their findings and ample photo evidence to back their claim that the Assad regime tortured and killed about 11,000 detainees.
We came to the conclusion that the killings were of an industrial kind, such that the evidence we found would certainly underpin any count of a crime at international law.
The photos were taken by a former Syrian military police officer who has since defected and fled the country.
The pictures were reminiscent of the worst pictures that came out of Belsen and Auschwitz after the Second World War. And these poor creatures were not just starved, but they were also tortured whilst they were starving.
Reacting to the report, the U.S. State Department condemned Syria in the strongest possible terms, saying the photos show apparent actions that would be serious international crimes. Britain's Foreign Secretary also expressed shock and horror at seeing the report.
I've seen a lot of this evidence. It is compelling and horrific. And it is important that those who have perpetrated these crimes are one day held to account.
Meanwhile, the world's leading human rights advocacy group has slammed the international community for not doing enough to end the atrocities being committed in Syria. In its annual report released on Tuesday, Human Rights Watch said world powers have focused too much on bringing President Bashar al-Assad and his government to the negotiating table and put aside humanitarian matters such as the protection of civilians.
What I hope the people gathered in Geneva will do is not simply to try to work out a long-term peace deal, but in the interim to put pressure on the Syrian government to stop targeting civilians, to stop deliberately depriving civilians of humanitarian aid.
The group also criticized Syria's close allies, Russia and China, for turning a blind eye to the humanitarian crisis in the country. Park Ji-won, Arirang News.
From that discomforting news to some disturbing stories for parents of young children here in Korea. A new report suggests that the youth of Korea have high levels of hazardous chemicals in their bodies. Our Shin Se-min explains.
Korean children have excessive amounts of lead, mercury, and bisphenol A in their bodies, levels far higher than those found in children in other countries. That's according to a Ministry of Environment report released Wednesday. It shows that Korean children between the ages of 6 and 18 have toxic substances like lead and mercury in their bodies at 7 times the level found in children in other developed countries. For mercury, the levels found were 7 times higher than were found in children in Canada. The report also found high levels of bisphenol A in children, a toxic material used mainly in plastic products. The amount of this toxin found in teenagers is nearly double that found in adults, particularly concerning as bisphenol A can disturb the endocrine system, which is responsible for producing hormones. The good news is that although the levels detected are quite high, they still fall below the dangerous level set by the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and the Environmental Protection Agency. Still, the numbers are alarming. A researcher at the National Institute of Environmental Research said that even though the toxic levels fall below the threshold of what's considered dangerous, if they remain consistent or even rise, they could lead to disorders related to the reproductive system. Children are more susceptible to toxins because of frequent exposure to toys with toxic chemical contents. To reduce exposure to these hazardous substances, it's advised that children wash their hands frequently and that parents be more mindful when purchasing toys. Shin Se-min, Arirang News.
Let's go over to our Kim Bo-kyung at the Weather Center for an update. Bo-kyung, the skies have cleared up compared to this morning.
That's right, Yeonji. An ultra-fine dust warning was issued yesterday night, but it was canceled earlier today.
Good to hear. How is the weather shaping up for the rest of the week then?
Well, Daniel, a warm-up is in the forecast. Temperatures have begun to rise, and it is currently 6 degrees here in Seoul, and numbers are forecast to jump to 8 on Friday afternoon. Now, this is higher than the seasonal average range, so no worries of winter chills for a while. Other than that, although fine dust has cleared out, it may come back due to the warm winter weather, so please continue to tune in for future weather updates. Taking a closer look at tomorrow's readings, Seoul starts off the day at -4 degrees with a high of 6. Meanwhile, Daegu and Gwangju hit 8. Moving on to other regions, Daejeon and Dokdo peak at 6 degrees, while Kumgang tops out at -2. Well, that's all I have for you this hour, and back to you guys.
Thank you for that, Bo-kyung, and that brings us to the end of our newscast. This has been Daniel Choi.
And I'm Kim Yeon-ji. Thank you for watching, and more news updates coming up at 8 p.m. Korea time.